Hi, it's Gary. Welcome to today's video. Well, nowadays, whenever you go out, even when you're in the office, when you're at home, you see ballpoint pens, you see rollerball pens everywhere. They've really become the de facto pen of use nowadays. But then occasionally, you'll come across an odd pen, something looking a little bit like this. That's a fountain pen. And for hundreds of years, fountain pens, they were the ones that you found everywhere. Now, fountain pens, they've got a long history. The first references come from 974 AD. So that's about 1200 years ago. And that was in Arab Egypt. And the reference we've got is about the Caliph. He wanted a pen that wouldn't stain his hands. If we jump forward to about 1520, Leonardo da Vinci, well, he died in 1519. But in his collection, he had designs for a fountain pen. And there's evidence from the way that some of his writings were that he was actually writing with a fountain pen. Now in 2011, an artist actually used the designs that he had and created some pens that did work. In the 17th century, fountain pens were widely available throughout the whole of Europe. And they've only grown in popularity since then. In 1940, fountain pens, they were still the dominant type of pen. They're what everybody was using. But ballpoints were starting to come on the scene. The early ballpoints, they did have issues. They leaked. They had problems with ink flow. But like everything else, they continued to be developed. And then in the 1960s, it turned around. Ballpoints started to become more popular and fountain pens, well, that just went down. Nowadays, ballpoints and rollerballs, well, they're everywhere you go. They're everything you're looking at. Virtually everybody either has or is using a ballpoint or a rollerball. But fountain pens, they've hung on. And they're actually starting to become more popular again. So what is a fountain pen? It can best be summarised as a writing instrument that uses a metal nib to apply a water-based ink onto paper. It's got an internal reservoir, that's what holds the ink, and this normally it's within the body of the pen. So what makes up a fountain pen? Let's switch the camera, let's go down to the desk, and we'll take a look at what a fountain pen is made from. So here we are down on the desk. As you can see, I've taken apart a fountain pen. This pen is called a Jinhao 159 and it was about $7 Australian, so it's a fairly inexpensive pen. Now there's not a lot of parts to this, is there? There's 5. We may add some other things in later on, which is things like an ink cartridge, but the actual part of the pen that does the work, very, very simple. The first one we're going to look at is the body, and that's actually this part. This is the bulk of the pen. In there, it's hollow. Why we have this in here is this is the reservoir. This is where the ink sits. As I said, for these particular ones, I use a cartridge or a cartridge converter. We'll look at those in a second. Now, there are different reservoir types. The first one is what's called an eyedropper filler pen. So this is an example of an eyedropper filler. What I do to put the ink in here is I unscrew this cap here. I'm not going to take it off because there is ink in this body. And then with a blunt nose syringe or with a dropper, I put the ink into the body, put this cap back on, and then that's able to write from there. That was the first type of pen that was used. They were all eyedroppered initially. But then as time went on, different filling systems came in. So we've mentioned the cartridge. I'll just fetch that in again. I actually use a cartridge converter rather than a cartridge itself. The converter, what that means is I can put different coloured inks in there. I'm not stuck with just the ink choice that comes in cartridges. So I quite like these. And they're very simple to work. You can push the plunger down, you dip the pen in ink, and you draw it up. We'll take a look at doing that later in the video. A couple of other popular reservoirs or filling mechanisms. This is a piston filler. Very similar, to be honest, to the way that the converter works. But you've got the plunger inside the actual body. So you twist the cap, that sends the plunger down, dip it in ink, and then as you pull that back, the pen, it draws ink up and into the body. The final one, these are now becoming more popular. This is what's called a vacuum filler. So here, the plunger starts off down at the bottom. What you do is you pull that plunger all the way out, dip it in the ink, then slowly push the plunger down. What you're doing as you're pushing this plunger down, you're creating a vacuum behind it. So we keep pushing it down until we get near the bottom. Now near the bottom here, it then widens out inside, so the plunger goes down, it releases that vacuum and that sucks the ink up. And that's just a couple of different mechanisms that there are. So that's a reservoir, that's where we're storing our ink. We've got the section just below it. The section is used to hold the nib in place. Again, we'll have a look at that in a second. The final one at the top here, we've got the cap. The cap, it's there, it goes on and it just seals that nib, keeps it protected. The working part of the pen though, that's this one here. Doesn't look very much, does it? It's just like some shaped plastic. This is called the feed. How this works is, it's hard to see, but there's a narrow channel there which has been cut into the plastic. If we turn it over, there's also a channel underneath. And what happens is it uses something called capillary action together with gravity. Because that channel is narrow, what it means is that there's a combination of surface tension and adhesive forces between the ink and the side, which lets the ink try and reach forward and grab onto the actual plastic, and it draws the ink down through that narrow channel. Why we've got multiple channels is if we were just fetching ink down, we'd soon end up with a vacuum inside the reservoir and the ink would stop flowing. By having multiple channels, what that means is that as ink is flowing down one, air is able to flow up the other. And that air pressure, that keeps that balance within the reservoir, and that's what enables that pen to keep on writing. Now these fins at the bottom, I don't know if we can see them nicely. Let me just see if I can spin that around. Hopefully you'll be able to see them. This is a collector. What this does is as the ink comes down, there's loads of ink coming down, and it collects in and around these fins, and it creates a buffer. So this is like a temporary storage area where the ink is stored. If we weren't doing that, then ink would just be gushing out all the time. But by using these, we're able to control that flow of ink. I mean, you can think of a fountain pen, the way it writes, it's just a controlled leak. That's all it is. There's nothing technical about it. The last part we're going to look at is this. This is the business end. This is the nib. This is what does the writing. Nibs can be made from loads of different materials. The most common ones being gold, steel, and titanium now is quickly becoming more popular. The material a nib is made from can really impact the price. A gold nib, well, that can cost over $100, whereas steel nibs, they could be, $2 or $3. It really is a massive, wide variation in price. The material that the nib is made from, well, it affects the way that the pen works, the way it writes. Gold nibs, they tend to be softer. There's a bit more bounce to them. Now, there are some gold nibs out there which are very, very stiff, but I find that the ones I have, they're softer and they're able to flex a bit, which means that as you're writing, the tines, which is the bit of metal either side of this slit, are able to spread a bit more, and that lets out a little bit more ink. And that more ink on the page gives you a wider line. Now, I've mentioned the tines and the slit. This slit, what that does is that's sat on top of the feed. Let me just position that very roughly at the moment. And then, so the ink's coming down the feed, and then this slit, again using capillary action, because that's very narrow, that draws the ink down the slit, down to the base here, to this tip. And on here you can see there's like a lump of metal. That's what's called an iridium tip. It's a bit of a misnomer though. It's not actually made from iridium. It's made from metals that are in the iridium family, And these metals, they're very resistant to wear. So why you have them here, why you've got that little bit of a tiny drop there, rather than the steel or the gold being what's touching the paper, it's this iridium tip. If it was the steel or the gold, then what you'd find, because the paper, it's naturally got an abrasion to it, it would wear down that tip, but the iridium gives it that extra strength so that it can keep going for years and years. This tipping material is important in another respect because this lets you control the width of the ink that's going to be put down. So on here, this is a fine nib. So it's a fairly small tip on the end. But you can get extra fine nibs, which are even smaller, medium, a little bit bigger, broad, bigger still. And then you can start getting into some of the more speciality cuts, things like a stub nib. I like stub nibs. Just going to fetch a stub nib in just so you can see it. What the stub nib does is it's wider going across than it is going down. This means that when you're writing a line with this wide end, it's wider. When you're going across, it's narrower. I will show you that in a second when I do some writing tests. So we've talked through the key parts of the pen. Let's now put this pen together. So I take the feed and I position the nib on top of it. Just going to turn this over. What I try to do is line it up so the shoulders of the feed line up roughly with the shoulders there of the nib, and that the middle of the feed is in line with the middle of that nib. I'm going to take this, which is the section. The nib fits in here. If we look on this one, you can see, yes, most of it's circular, but then we've got a little flat cutout there at the bottom. And here on the feed, we've got a flat cutout. So I'd line them up, and then it's a case of just gently pressing it in, making sure that my feed and nib stay aligned. I just keep checking that as I'm going. So there we are, that's in. So that's now solidly in there. Cartridge converter is what I use here. So the cartridge converter, that then goes in and it clicks onto the end of the feed. So this is then going to allow the ink to go out of the converter, down into the feed, into the nib and onto paper. The back of the body then screws on to the top of the section, and the cap, that will screw on, and that gives us our full pen. Now this is interesting enough, but it's a writing instrument. We need to see it right, don't we? So what I'm going to do is put some ink in this pen. I'm just going to fetch this in. This is a dragon. It's a pot that I got from a charity shop, but it holds this ink bottle nice. Hopefully helps to stop it from tipping over. This ink is made by a company called Robert Oster, and the ink is actually called Aussie Brown. One of the things I like with fountain pens, there's a massive variety of different ink that you can use. You've got different colours. Yes, you've got your standard black, your blue, your red, your green. In this case, I'm going to use a brown. But not only have we got the standard colours, we've got loads of different shades of those colours. So blues, I've got about 30 different shades of blue, and each one, they look different when you're writing with them. So what I'm going to do is now fill this pen up. I've taken the body off. So the first thing, this plunger here, we need to have the plunger down at the bottom because we're going to be drawing that ink up. So I've screwed that plunger all the way down. I'm going to pop it into the bottle, and then I'll slowly fetch the plunger up, and that will draw ink in, which we'll have a look at in a second. So let's go and fill this. So there's the nib going in. And unfortunately, you only get to see my hands on this part. It's hard to actually show it working. And there we are. We've now got ink inside that converter. Just clean off the nib. One of the things with this, you end up with ink all over everything. So I give the nib a good clean, get any excess ink off, and then I can pop this back together. So there we have a filled fountain pen. Pop the lid back on and move the ink out of the way. I'm going to fetch in a notebook. This is an A5 notebook, plain paper. It's made by a company called Rhodia. One of the things with fountain pens, choice of paper is very important. Yes, you could use any old paper. It will write regardless of the paper type. But by getting paper that works well with a fountain pen, that lets you fetch out more of the character of the ink, can make a big difference to the way you think about it. So we've got our pen here, we've got our paper. Let's do some writing. So we've got here a Jinhao 159. I actually think this might be a medium nib looking at it. Could be fine. I bought this from China and you've got a very limited choice there of nibs. The ink, Robert Oster, Aussie Brown. I'm just going to show you what it's like when I write. So this is when I put no pressure on that nib. What I'm going to do now is put some pressure on. And this is what I was saying about flexing. So the tines, they spread a bit more and we get a wider line. We put more ink down. You can see that really nicely if I do it like this. So where I'm going up, I'm taking the pressure off. Then when I come down, I put the pressure on so we can see we get that line variation. I mentioned about the stub nib. Here's the stub nib. So this is a Retro 51. And it's the Tornado model with a 1.1 stub nib. The ink in here is by a different company. It's called Diamine. And it's vintage copper. Again, let's look at our line variation. So I'm just going to go down. So this is going down. I'm going to go across. And this is what I was saying that you get from the stub nib. You get this line variation built in. There's the S's. It's a fairly new pen to me, so I'm still getting used to the nib on this. Again, we're showing here you get a different range of inks. And within the inks, you get some different properties. So here on the Robert Oster Aussie Brown, you can see the actual colour has got some shading into it. So parts of the letters are dark. That's where we're getting more ink going down. But then we've got other parts which are a paler brown, which to me, it all adds character to the writing. And one of the things why I like a fountain pen. Again, here with the vintage copper, you can see that we've got that shading. Now, I'm not sure if it comes up on here. I don't think it does. But this ink has also got little copper particles in it. So as you're writing, you get some sparkle off that copper particles as well. So unfortunately, it's not really showing in my writing sample. So that's writing with the fountain pens. So that's how fountain pens work. It's not a pen that a lot of people use, which I think is a shame because it's quite enjoyable to use a fountain pen, especially with the inks because you've got such a wide variety. You can use all those different colours. Now, people may think, well, fountain pens, they're expensive. They're not. You can get them from just a couple of dollars. And yes, I know there are some that cost thousands, but you don't need to spend that sort of money. $2, $3 will get you going. So this is how a fountain pen works. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. Have you got a fountain pen? Are you interested in trying out some fountain pens? Please drop a comment down below. Let's kickstart the conversation. Please hit the thumbs up button. Every time you like, every time you comment, just helps with the YouTube algorithm. If you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel so that you can get new videos as I release them. I'll talk to you again soon.